Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairy Tales. If you've never been here before, you're watching it on Varietal Literature's YouTube page. And, well, this is just a cozy place for narrative. But here in the spooky seasons, or at least on the advent of it, we will be covering, I guess, less cozy things. And specifically tonight, we're going to talk about one of the most common figures in the world's folklore, which is spirits that sit on your chest. But we're going to focus in on the the ones that I haven't heard of before, which are called Walrider, which are German chest-crushing spirits, and they have their own lore and their own specifics, and as fascinating as it is that they have so much in common with a bunch of other things, they also have a ton of their own unique lore that I just did not see coming. And we're going to go through all of that tonight, from the spooky to the silly, and hopefully you'll enjoy that. With that said, when we get to, if you are not watching this live, rather, down in the description below, there are timestamps, and there will be several stories. So if there's one you don't like, or you just want to get ahead, because I'm going to do a little bit of preamble on this, if you don't care about any of that and you're not watching it live, look for those timestamps, jump ahead to whatever interests you. I'm perfectly fine with that. So with that said, if you are here live, though, you can join us in the live chat, which already has GS and Genera in it. GS says, "Good evening, chest-crushing spirits, everybody's worst nightmare." Apparently, we'll talk about how widespread these are as a folklore phenomena. Genera says, "What kind of chest? Could mean loot or could mean a very painful end." A very painful end. Not fun chest. Okay, wait. Let me do that take again. A very painful end. There we go. Yes, we will have some sound effects in the storytelling. So again, if you just want to get to the storytelling, there will be timestamps down in the description below. There will be a pinned comment where the translator of these tales, Jürgen Hubert, you can get them for yourself. I'm not reading all of his translated tales of the Walrider, for several reasons, some of which so that you'll go and give him some money on Patreon and support translators. But let's talk about these things. So first of all, just in general in the stream, we are pretty close to full-blown spooky zone. Just my way of saying not every story tonight is particularly atmospheric and horrifying. They're going to start out that way, and then they're going to tend towards more curiosity about how the German countryside and various regions understood these spirits. By the time we get to next week, we will definitely be full bore on it. And the reason why we're running a little bit on a lag there is because we are in October proper, is because I did end up missing a day, and this was originally meant to be the last one in September, due to a power outage and whatever else. Anyways, so that's the nature of things. It's not full creepy tonight, but I'm going to try my best to make all the ones after this up to October. And we do have a show on Halloween night. We lined up that way this year, so I'll try to find something good for that. With that said, let's talk a little bit about this, because these are particularly interesting phenomenon, the chest spirits. Wikipedia sort of lumps them together as night hags or hags. I don't know if that's the best way to the common thread between them, because they are quite variable in how they present. They can be demons or whatever else. But I will say this. I'm not a person who really believes in spirits, demons, devils, or the like. However, if I were, chest-sitting spirits would be the ones I would be most persuaded to actually exist as described. And the reason for that is because these spirits, in some form with a lot of similarities, spring up in so many disparate, largely unconnected cultures, and they do follow a fairly similar pattern. You can go to the Wikipedia page. It has a pretty comprehensive list of them. Some of them I already knew beforehand. Some of them I didn't. I was doing some research for this. But it ranges from China, Scandinavia, Malta, Thailand, Japan, Korea, the southern U.S., Egypt, Ethiopia, a whole bunch of African tribes and cultures had this stories about chest-sitting spirits of some regard. And they all kind of come along in the same way. They cause some kind of paralysis and suffocation while sleeping, and typically they sit on your chest and stare at you. There are plenty of articles on why so many non-related cultures may have come up with the same kind of imagery, and it really comes down to the kind of things that would cause paralysis and suffocation while sleeping, and the idea that, you know, it's just sort of your half dreaming sleep brain trying to contextualize sleep disorders and stuff like that. But I'm not really going to get into that. I'm not too interested in the debunking whatever. I don't know. I'm here for stories. But if you're curious about it, there are articles about this, and they're pretty compelling. But tonight we're focusing on accounts from Germany, which has a really unique take on the chest-sitting spirit that includes things like milk sieves and shoulder blades used as for rowing. England comes up a lot in a surprising way. Cats, a lot of beautiful women, and a great deal of other lovely folklore nonsense. Since many of the stories assume you know the basics of Walrider, I'm just going to give you... I'm going to start with a couple of just straightforward accounts of what supposedly happens when they come and crawl into your bed. But I will give you just the general Cole's notes of it now, because, again, some stories just assume you already know that and carry on with some interesting anecdote about how somebody dealt with them. It usually involves some shadowy character coming into your bedroom at night, often hairy and monstrous at first at least, not always though, that crawls from the foot of your bed in the night and comes to sit on your chest, and wherever it crawls it makes you so heavy you cannot move, paralyzes you, pardon me. It then usually sits upon your chest, watches you struggle to breathe, and in some way drains energy from you. And sometimes that's ill-defined and left implied, and sometimes it's a little more literal. And in that regard, they have a lot in common with vampires, to be honest. That's something Jurgen notes in his notes, but I think anybody could probably see the connection there. There's even them coming in as mists. Anyways, with that pretext out of the way of what the general story of a Walrider is, and Genera says, sounds like a cat, lol. Sometimes they take the form of cats. We'll talk about that for sure. But let's get into a whole bunch of stories, like close to 10 or something. Most of them are quite short. It's going to be that kind of show. We don't do these too often, but they come up. Going through various accounts of the Walrider sitting upon your chest. And one thing I will add here is, unlike a lot of tales, I think most of the direct accounts of this are from people who very sincerely believe what they've seen, which adds something to how they are told. Okay. Let's do a little bit of rain. Our first story tonight, as will all our stories, comes from Jürgen Hubert's collection Sunken Castles, Evil Poodles, which is a collection of recently translated German folklore, and you can support him at his Patreon in the linked comment below that will be pinned when this video is no longer live. Our first tale from that collection is called The Walrider, A Victim's Tale. A woman from the parish of Halle describes the plague as follows. Because of those beings, I left the service of my family, as I was constantly plagued by a Walrider in their house for 2 years. Only when there were heavy winds and rain outside did I get some quiet, and when I moved away, the mistress told me that the Walrider would follow me to the new household I was going to serve in. And this indeed did take place, but I was only then bothered by her a few times, for apparently the way was now too long for her. I've always clearly heard the Walrider approaching, but I never saw her. And when she came, I first experienced sawing and roaring between sounds in my ears, and then there were a few punches against my bedsheet, and then she had caught me, and I could not move any of my limbs. I could utter no sounds except for a slight whimpering. I had hardly any air left to breathe, and I was overcome with such terrible dread that I sweated all over my body, and I felt pressure from my chest to my knees, and I was terribly frightened, and I frequently cried because of this. The Walrider not only visited me in the evening or during the night, but it even ambushed me during the day, whether I was asleep or awake in my bed or away from it. And when I sat down in the main chamber in the evening and I leaned my head on the cradle, she pushed me down as well. Those who were in the chamber with me also noticed this, and I could hear them say amongst each other, "The Walrider is pushing her down again." At another time, I was sleeping in the open field in the summer, and I felt that she wanted to drag me away. She wanted to heave me into the swamp. When I was sleeping on my back, I was pestered far more than when I was lying on my side. Carrying on to another account of how these tend to show. Our next story also comes from Jürgen Hubert's translations, and it's called A Captured Walrider. A young man from the Münsterland area told the following. One evening, I was in bed, and the moon was shining brightly into my room, so that I was able to see everything clearly. And then I noticed that a small child stood on the bed next to my feet. And when I perceived it, it fell on my chest, and it blew into my mouth, and I was unable to move any limbs and hardly able to breathe. And after the child had tortured me for a while, it ran away, and I grasped for it and grasped at its hairs, and then it transformed into a beautiful maiden. Now, the idea of a beautiful maiden, we're not going to actually cover too much in this show, but it comes up a lot later. There will be some mentions of it in other stories. So you can see these are just our classic little accounts. We're going to do one more that's a slightly less dramatic but also is still a pretty standard one. And then we will start talking about a little bit more of the peculiarities of this particular creature under German folklore. The next one is called Walriders as cats. So Gennaro should like it. It also comes to us from Jürgen Hubert's collection. A farmhand in Rusterfeld in the parish of Visvik, who suffered strongly from Walriders, once slept in a barn at noon. His fellow farmhand went to the barn, but when he opened the door, he saw 4 many-colored cats sitting on the sleeping man. He jumped back so that he could grab a stick, and then they were already gone. Now, it's not the only account. It's the only one we're going to read. It's not the only account that relates this to cats, but they're never really supposed to literally be cats. So, before we carry on to some of the aspects that make this maybe less horror but more tragic as a character in German folklore, it is worth pointing out that Walriders share a lot of folklore qualities about witches, which isn't surprising, really. But the cat thing probably is a connection to that. It's also probably a connection to the fact that cats sit on your chest. Alright, now we get into the less expected corners of it. And if you stick with me, even though it becomes a little less horror as we go, it gets no less weird. I promise you, you will not see most of where this lore is going coming. It's probably a better way to phrase that. So with that said, let's get into the origins of Walriders. So our next tale is called the Unfortunate Walrider. It also comes to us from Jürgen Hubert's translations of German folklore. Again, the pinned comment below can help you if you want to help him do his translations on his Patreon. A girl with a spotless reputation who served as a maid, pardon me, with a farmer in Charel, once was ordered by her masters to knead some dough into bread in a side building. And after some time, the senior maid then went to look over after her, and found that the younger maid had slumped over the kneading trough in an apparently lifeless state. The priest was fetched, and he examined the seemingly dead girl and explained that she was a Walrider. Her spirit had thus left her body in order to torture other people, but it would soon come back, and everyone should leave the body in its original position, for otherwise the spirit would not find its way back, and her real death would be inevitable. However, just because the girl was a Walrider, this fact did not make her a bad person, for she could not change her fate, and was merely unfortunate. So this here we get something that is distinctly German. Now, I'm not a master folklorist, despite what the impression I might send by running this show. I'm a storyteller. But the bits that I do know about other chest-sitting spirits is that they don't have such sympathetic tales. They're mostly sort of tenacious spirits or malicious spirits or devils or demons or something like that. So the idea that this is this idea that your spirit, if you are born a Walrider and your spirit is kind of has its own agenda and occasionally leaves you, isn't restrained to this one tale. We're going to look at some other examples of that and how it manifests and how it's described, because it puts a very different and interesting twist, I think, a sort of dramatic irony, or maybe not irony, but tragedy on the whole Walrider lore. So the next story reiterates this kind of idea in another way. It's called The Third Daughter is Out. So our next story is The Third Daughter is Out, and it also comes from Jürgen Hubert's collection of tales. It's called Sunken Castles, Evil Poodles, which are all translations he's made recently from German. This one comes from Halle in the Huda municipality. A traveling artisan's journeyman asked a farmer for a place to stay for the night. The farmer didn't want to, but after repeated pleading, he agreed to let the journeyman stay in his house. Journeyman, by the way, being like a tradesman who's going on a journey. Sort of. We've talked about it before. I'm not going to bog the whole story down. In the evening, the journeyman told the farmer that he had 3 really lively daughters. But one of them wasn't spending much time in the house at night, though she was unaware of this. Since the farmer didn't want to believe this, the latter led him to the closet bed, where the 3 girls slept. 2 of them slept like other people normally do, but the third was lying as if she were dead, and did not show any signs of life. The journeyman then closed the door of the bed, and soon the 2 of them saw something in front of the alcove that looked like smoke or mist, and it seemed to be searching for an opening. And as the journeyman opened the door again, the mist moved inside and life returned into the third daughter. So there we see again this idea that at random times life leaves you, your spirit goes out and does this terrible thing where it sucks life and kills people in their sleep and torments them. But it's not your fault, which is peculiar. Normally these sorts of things occur because of something you've done to upset God, and you get right with God or something and you're better, but that's not the case here. The other thing that is pretty typical here is that usually these spirits are either sort of presented as monsters or ladies of some sort, women of some sort. And that is very true of the German Walrider. But we're going to look at one story where it is not the case. It's one of the only ones we have of not a woman or monster being the Walrider, but it carries with this idea that it's a fate sort of imposed upon you that you cannot defy. This one takes place by the water. Our next story is called The Walrider Helmsman, and it also comes from Jürgen Hubert's translations. In one winter, a ship captain had moored his ship in the harbor of Emden and left his helmsman on board to guard it. But when he checked on his ship, just once again, he noticed that the ship was not at precisely the same place He thus hid himself on the ship without the helmsman's knowledge so that he could determine what the latter was doing with his ship. Well, in the night, the anchors were hoisted as he hid down by the hull, and the ship was whisked away at a high speed. And it was around midnight that he felt that ship anchored again, and he heard the helmsman walk out onto shore. Now the captain likewise slunk out of his hiding place and looked around, but the land around him was unknown to him. So he took out his knife and cut off several stems that were growing at the shore and took them with him back into his hiding place in his ship. Soon after, the helmsman returned, and the journey back went past in equal hurry. At one time, though, the ship experienced a mighty jolt. But was not slowed down by this. The next morning, the captain confronted the helmsman, asked him what he'd been doing the previous night and where he'd been. Well, the helmsman first claimed ignorance. Then the captain showed the stems, which he turned out to be Spanish cane. It was then that the helmsman confessed and said that he was a Walrider, and he had to follow his fate, but elaborated no further on that. He also asked the captain if he had noticed the jolt the ship had experienced on the way back, and explained that during the journey through the air he was traveling at an altitude that was too low, and thus he had hit a church tower, which he named. Which I suspect is just a way of sort of establishing the anti-religious nature of his activities. So in these three most recent stories, we see this idea that Walriders are assigned a fate, and there's very little they can do to overcome it. It's not clear what happens if they refuse it. I won't read the whole section about this, but we are going to read a little bit of commentary that was translated by Jürgen, not his own, from someone named Strakayan, about Walriders. However, I'm not going to read all of it. There's a bunch of it translated. It's all fascinating. You should absolutely go and get Sunket Gassel's Evil Poodles through his Patreon and read it yourself. We are going to read one section of it, but I will add something from another section of it, which talks about the idea that there was, for example, some theories that if you had 7 daughters, one of them would be a Walrider, and if you had 7 sons, one of them would be a werewolf, which was interesting. I don't have any tales at hand that show that, but that was an interesting detail. But it is interesting, though I don't think it's that prevalent, because we've already seen stories where people are Walriders that aren't women, and that weren't in families of 7. GS says, can you be fired for being a Walrider? Is that unethical, a wrongful dismissal? I mean, the priest said it was unethical to kill them, so one must assume you can't. I don't know. Who knows? That is an interesting question, I think, though. Not one of any serious import in modern time, but it would have been important then if you truly believed this. So we're going to read a little bit of commentary. Because it sets up the next chunk of Walrider lore, which isn't just that they're involuntary in German lore, but some of the weird habits they keep. So some it seems like there is this one idea that they're involuntary and your spirit leaves your body and you sort of die, and if you move the person, they'll die forever, and that idea keeps coming up. But then it introduces what we'll see in this next session, this idea that where those spirits originate is from women, usually from England. And it's pretty precise about that. There's lots of historical reasons why that would probably be the case. But we're going to read this little section from a commentator on German folklore, Strachan. According to the oldest tales, the Walrider must be viewed as beings of other than human nature. They may appear in human form and are related to humans in many ways, but they live according to different laws and are imbued with different abilities. Without a doubt, these tales have preserved many things which were believed about Valkyries and other female deities riding on top of and driving behind wolves. And I'm going to share in Jurgen's skepticism about that. I don't know that that's the connection here, really. That feels thin. According to these tales, the Walriders are extremely beautiful and have likewise beautiful singing voices. We'll definitely see mentions of their beauty in a second. England is usually considered to be their home. They traverse over the waters in order to visit their victims. Their boat is a milk sieve. Their oars are the fan-shaped shoulder blades of animals or humans, according to the legends of Zaterland, or the ribs of cows, or both. In the higher elevation parish of Visbeck, which lacks navigable waters, they travel through the air, but on a sieve they call a ship. They apparently also use real ships to travel through the air. On land, Walriders are also frequently ride horses and braid their manes. We're not going to see any stories about this, so that they can hold on to them comfortably or use their loops as stirrups. They also choose the best horses because they are the fastest and frequently rush them so much that they can be found sweating and panting in the stables the next morning. The braids, the Walrider, weave into the manes of the horses cannot be unraveled. They must be burned out with sanctified candles or cut out with a crosscut and then burnt. It may also occur that sorry, it was playing a song I don't have the right to play. It may also occur that a Walrider transforms their human victim into a horse in order to make them pay for their lust of riding and traveling, or just in general for no particular reason. We are going to see a tale of that. The Walriders are supposed to rest amidst the tangles commonly seen among the branches of beech trees, which resemble a crow's nest. These tangles are called witch nests. We won't see any stories about that. But that gives you a couple of ideas. They ride around in milk sieves. They come to us from England, and they are beautiful ladies. And we're going to look at some tales that elaborate this idea. GS says, love the lack of responsibility attached to the horrifying acts of the Walrider. Yeah, it is interesting, and it's interesting to me for a very particular reason. My degree was in philosophy, and as a part of philosophy, you read a lot of different things, but Nietzsche has this theory in genealogy of morals. I think it is? No. It's sort of spread throughout his works. I'm trying to think where he's most deliberate about it. Maybe genealogy of morals. Anyways, it might have been Beyond Good and Evil or Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He kind of talks about it throughout. This idea that the old world gods, and he doesn't just mean pagan here, he's also talking like Old Testament gods and stuff like that. There was this idea that you were sort of enthralled to them. And so when you did crazy things and when you did violent things and whatever else, it wasn't really a personal failing of you. It was this god possessed you, and people understood that was a part of the human fabric. Now, he goes on and makes a bunch of ethical sort of arguments based on these ideas, but we don't need to, just to observe how this is an old world way of looking at responsibility, the idea that you were possessed by something and that therefore it's not really your fault. It's just how the world goes, which is interesting, at least. Also, take it with a grain of salt. There's lots of things that Nietzsche was good at, but history of the world isn't one of them. Okay. So now we're going to look at this idea that they are English spirits, and then the last section we're going to look at how can you defeat a Walrider? Because I'm sure at this point all of you are quite concerned. All right. Our next tale is called A Walrider in Barßel. A man from Barßel once cut his grain at night, and since he became tired around midnight, he laid down beneath a haystack in order to sleep. And it was then, from a distance, lovely singing approached, and came closer and ever closer. Until it was almost adjacent to the resting man. And it was then he saw that it was a Walrider whose song he had heard and who had traveled here with her boat from England. And she put her milk sieve and oar beneath a haystack and went to Barßel to do her business. So he snuck out from under the haystack where he rested and hurried to steal those objects for himself, her boat and rowing, and oars rather. With the beginning of twilight, the Walrider returned, searching diligently for her gear, and started to wail pitifully as she could not find it. The reaper was moved by this, and gave the milk sieve and oar back, and the Walrider promised that she would put a whole roll of linen under the haystack in the next night. And the Walrider kept her word. The linen was found and was used up without harm. There was a similar story reported from Charles, though there the approaching Walrider was surrounded by a whirlwind on her ship. Genera says you don't defeat it. You name it, feed it, love it, and accept the fact that you now have a cat. Now, this idea of linen being left under a haystack comes up a lot. Keep in mind that linen was very hard to make. It is arguable, just based on folklore, that like half the reason you married any woman as a man was to have someone to make linen. So, yeah. Being left a roll of linen was a big deal. Now, speaking of gifts, I don't know that actually we're going to look at another one where linen gets left behind, but let's look at a... oh, no, I think it might come up in this one. I read so many of these. I'm apologizing here. Some of them have melded together. This one is called The Walrider's Gifts, and it also comes from Jürgen Hubert's Sunken Castles, Evil Poodles, or at least the translation does. Now, one morning, a farmer and his farmhand went out to fetch the horses from the pasture. And then they witnessed how a Walrider hid her milk sieve and oar behind the haystack located near the road. When the Walrider had gone ahead, they took the boat and oar and waited until she had returned. And when the Walrider found neither boat nor oar, she was deeply saddened. And as dawn began to break, she cried out, Marici! Marici! Which is a word, just as a note here, that Jürgen could not find a translation for, so we have no idea what it means. Then the farmer and the farmhand took pity on the beautiful woman and walked to her. She pleaded fervently to give her possessions back to her, as she urgently needed to go back to England, and she promised to put a shirt for each of them under the haystack the next night. The two of them allowed themselves to be moved by this plea, and in the next night the shirts were indeed found in their promised place. Now, before I continue this story, I want you to remember this line from the previous story. where it says, the Walrider kept her word, the linen was found and was used up without harm. Which might have seemed like a strange thing to say, but let's find out why it's not. The farmer was overjoyed at the beautiful linen and wanted to put on the shirt immediately, but the farmhand held him back and told him that he wanted to let the large yard dog crawl through the shirt first before they were to try it on. He did so, and behold, the dog dropped dead. Then the farmer likewise let a dog crawl through his shirt, and that dog dropped dead as well. It was then that the farmer and his farmhand put on the shirts, and these shirts allegedly never became worn out. What a weird story. Jurgen points out, like, that's quite the assumption to be making. Like, it already killed one thing. Why would you think it would be fine the next time? Also, F's in chat for the poor puppies. I would prefer a dog to a shirt. Okay. So there is this idea then that you can get gifts from the Walriders, but it's a real 50-50 if they're going to be terrible or not. So let's look at another sort of gift from them. That if you have been a consistent viewer of the show, is a gift that will sound familiar. Yeah, exactly. Gennaro says, this shirt killed my dog. Sounds safe to wear. Absolutely terrible reasoning. Okay. Do a little bit of rain. A little bit of this. A little bit of campfire. Our next story is called The Walrider's Ransom, and it also comes from Jürgen Hubert's Sunken Castles, Evil Poodles. Once someone observed a Walrider hiding her sieve and oar, and they took both these items. But when the Walrider returned, she pleaded for a long time until she got her possessions back. In return, she promised to bring him a keg with golden pieces. However, he would have to arrive before dawn and must not take the keg with him. Now, when he arrived in the morning, he discovered the keg, but it was filled with horse droppings. Well, screwed out of his ransom anyways, he decided as a joke to take a handful of droppings with him. When the sun rose, he had glittering pieces of gold in his hand. Then he wanted to get the rest, of course, but that keg with its contents were gone. This is the same thing that Frau Gauden, my absolute favorite character of German folklore, who is the mother of the Wild Hunt, who I'm currently working on a story that she features in, sort of a retelling of a piece of folklore. Gias says, oh crap. Did as well. She would give you horse dung or dog poop because she rides with hounds. And people would be like, yeah, I guess so. And then they would discover that it was solid lumps of gold the next day. And of course, they always come back to get it and it's no longer there. Whatever the message of that is. Like... It's hard to say. Sometimes it goes the other way in folklore too. Sometimes you get gold that turns to useless stuff and poop and whatever else. Because honestly, don't read too much into it. It's a bunch of bar stories at the end of the day, and they probably just thought it was funny. Now, the next one is a peculiar one, but it is still based around this idea that Walriders are English spirits, and it's probably one of the more deliberate about it. It also touches on the idea that regular people are Walriders, and don't seem to be able to help it much. It ties all this weird lore together, and after this one, we'll talk about how they are defeated. Okay. This is Holland, so there will be wind. You might say this is German stories. Yes, but the Germans, of course, did work in Holland. Although, what is meant by Holland here, Jürgen makes this point, there are a lot of wrongly, in old German lore, wrongly assigned all of Netherlands to Holland and so on, and a whole bunch of regions that just weren't Holland. Anyways, the point is, it's not clear where it is, but it's someone working outside of Germany. This is called the Walrider Scissors, and it carries on with this strange little aspect of German folklore where they are English spirits. Coming from a translation by Jürgen Hubert in Sunken Castles Evil Poodles, which you should support by clicking on the pinned comment below. Now, once 2 workers from Goldenstedt, who assisted with mowing grass in Holland, and let me pause you there. When I say mowing, I don't mean no. I mean scything down grass. Laid down to rest after a long day of work. And when one of them was sleeping, a Walrider was immediately attached to him, crushing him. The other one, who was still awake, looked around to see if he could spot anything, and then he saw a small sieve close to the waters. And he went there, he picked it up, and as he examined it, he saw a pair of scissors within it. He pocketed the scissors, put the sieve back, wanting to observe what would happen with it. When suddenly he saw a woman quickly jumping into the sieve and vanishing with it, he told the other one immediately what he had seen, as well that he still had the scissors. But when the other one told him that the Walrider had tormented him terribly, he regretted that he hadn't kept the sieve as well. When he returned home, he told his wife about the incident and gave her the scissors. Well, soon afterwards, one of their neighbors visited, and that strange but distinct pair of scissors was just lying on their table. And when the neighbor spotted the scissors, she said, "Look, there are my scissors. I had lost them." "And that might very well be," replied the woman, "as my husband had found them. You must have left them behind in Holland." But before responding, and with shock on her face, the woman ran away. For now they knew who the Walrider was. And there we get the first impression that, to answer GS's earlier question, maybe not everyone was so merciful to them. Okay. So we've seen so far the idea that they are these horrid things. In this particular line of lore, it's not clear that they ever kill anyone. There is some stories I didn't read where it implies that they are worn out by it. And I think we'll see at least one story where it mentions them being very thin because of it. And we get this impression that they are sort of energy vampires of some sort. They get something. They are compelled for some reason to torment people. But it may be involuntary. That they ride around in milk sieves for some reason, rowing boats with bones and sailing in the sky and so on and so forth, and that they are a beautiful woman. and that they may be tied to unintentionally or otherwise good people who unintentionally manifest this but seem to be aware of it. Of course, I'm trying to draw some stitches between what are essentially a bunch of disparate stories, and I do need to put my usual disclaimer in, that if you're going to go out into the world and say, well, that's not what a real Walrider is, there is no account that really lines up with the other in any significant way on the details. They have trends in common, they have features in common, but they are ultimately contradictory tales because they are just folklore. So don't go berate someone because they have the ontology of Walriders wrong. There is no right one, really. But let's talk about what happens if you know you have this terrible Walrider problem and you want to get rid of it. Well, there are several things you can do. And the first one I want to discuss is called a heckling comb. Now, a heckling comb is not really a comb in our sense. It's a board with long iron spikes, like long as fingers at least, that stick up out of the board, and they're for processing flax into threads that you can weave and make eventually cloth and thread out of. They're mean-looking things. They sort of, if you want to Google a heckling comb, you should. They are nasty-looking things. Very sharp, tall iron spikes on a board in close cluster. Well, because they are kind of nasty things, and because they do sit about the width of a chest, they are used in trying to defy Walriders, but I must say, I do not recommend this approach. And let me tell you why. Our first story about defying a Walrider is the Walrider and the comb, and it connects to our next story, so I'm going to kind of read them in sequence, called Walrider Rides Away. A man in Ramslow was tortured frequently by a Walrider, and in order to protect himself, he put a heckling comb with the tips pointed upwards on himself. Now, when the Walrider arrived, she turned the comb over and asked, "If I were to do to you what you wanted to do to me, how would you fare?" She then threw the comb away and gave him a good beating all over, and since then he no longer took a heckling comb to bed with him. So it didn't work, but you can understand why he thought it might, because as they crawl on the chest, those spikes would sink into them, maybe, depending on how much of a spirit and how much of an animal they are. However, there is another attempt that goes, I'm going to say, a bit worse. This story is called The Walrider Rides Away. A man in Vonhorn, in the Vispic parish, was visited nightly by the Walrider. He frequently heard her coming but he couldn't keep her away. He always took a stick with him, but when he lashed around with it, she suddenly dropped on him. So he could neither move nor even twitch. And then one evening, he took a heckling comb and tied it to his chest, so that when she fell upon him, she would fall on the sharp tips where she dropped on him. And he hoped that these visits would cease afterwards. Oh, but when she returned, that comb was turned over, ends sharp upon his ribs and bare flesh. and she slammed down, as she always did, stabbing him in the chest so that he was in piteous pain and would wail if he could even breathe. Wow. When he told his neighbor about his suffering and how he was unable to save himself from the Walrider, she told him that he should just pay attention in the evening, and when he noticed that something was coming, he should shout, "I wish that you should ride a broomstick all night." And when he suspected that the Walrider was in the room, he quickly shouted, "I wish that you should ride on the highest masts on the oceans all night." And then he heard a wailing voice lament, "Oh, how you have taken me for a ride!" And after that, the Walrider never came again. Gia says, "Don't cheek a Walrider." Yeah. So don't use heckling combs. Attempts have been made. I advise against it. We're going to read a story now about, it's very particular, but one way that a Walrider was gotten rid of, and then a few others before we wrap up. There is just so many stories about Walriders. I've cut out maybe half of them. Okay. Our next story is called Riding the Walrider. In the parish of Wildehausen, there were two farmhands serving a farmer who slept in a single bed. The senior farmhand, who slept at the front of the bed, became very skinny, though he was otherwise healthy. Thus the other one asked him why he became so skinny. "For you are not ill, as you eat as much as I do." And the senior farmhand answered, "If you experienced the things as I did, you would become skinny as well." Well, obviously the other farmhand didn't let up questioning the senior farmhand until the latter had told the whole story. Whenever they were lying in bed, so the story went, a Walrider came each evening and put a halter on him, which is like a horse bit for riding, the head stuff on a horse. Then he was immediately transformed into a horse, and she rode on him all night. Literally, get your head out of the gutter. Then the other one said, "If it's nothing more than that, I shall lie at your position in the evening. When she comes, I shall be able to deal with her." And so, of course, the senior farmhand was content with this, but they didn't tell anyone so that the Walrider wouldn't learn of this plan, except for each other right now. Then, as they went to bed in the evening, the senior farmhand lay at the back end of the bed, and the other one at the front. And the senior farmhand, who had been ridden the night before, immediately started to sleep. But the other one did not sleep and only stayed quiet. And after some time had passed, he heard something approach. And as soon as the Walrider was next to him, she attempted to throw the halter over his head, but he quickly grasped for it, managed to grab the halter, and threw it over the head of the Walrider, who was immediately transformed into a horse. And so he mounted upon it and quickly forced it to gallop to a smith, and then he had the smith shoe the horse in the middle of the night. Then he rode it back home, removed the halter, and allowed the Walrider to leave. When they rose the next morning, the farmer's wife did not want to leave the bed. When she was lifted out of it by force by the farmer, she was unable to walk, for she had horseshoes on her feet. Thus the woman was exposed as the Walrider. The farmer couldn't understand how this could have happened until the farmhand told him everything, and then the farmhand had to hand the halter over, and the farmer put it on his wife and led her to the smith as a horse. The smith then had to remove the horseshoes again, but the farmer did not give her the halter back. Now this is interesting because in many ways, it doesn't need her to be a Walrider for this story to happen. It could just be someone with a magic halter. It doesn't really seem that anything about her makes her a Walrider, but there you go. They called it that. There's one way. Ride the Walrider. Now we're going to look at some simpler ways. And then a very violent way. And then we will wrap up. This tale is called The Walrider Visits for Lunch. And it also comes to us from Jürgen Hubert. A farmhand in Schweibock was visited frequently by the Walrider, and because he was unable to get rid of her, he quit his position and intended to leave his farm. He could handle the torment no longer. But his master wanted to know the reason why he no longer wanted to stay. And when the farmhand explained the situation, the master told him that when the Walrider came the next night, he should merely tell her during her departure, "Come back tomorrow at noon. Eat something with me." Well, the farmhand had little to lose. Didn't want to leave his job anyways, so he slept next to the grand chamber that night, and when his foe returned, the farmhand followed the advice of his master, whereupon the Walrider dispersed like a flame upon hearing the invitation. The next morning, a roofer visited under the pretense of improving a small spot at the stables, though none had called for such a roofer. And the roofer joined for lunch, and since then, the farmhand has not been bothered. So there you go. There's one way to get rid of a Walrider. Invite him to lunch. Or her to lunch, usually. So we can ride them like a horse. No heckling combs. Ride them like a horse. They'll learn. Put some horseshoes on them. Or invite them to lunch. Or probably the more classic way of doing this is in our next tale, which is called The Grappled Walrider, which also comes to us from Jürgen Hubert. Oop. Sorry, glitched. There we go. A farmhand in Luton was visited so frequently by a Walrider that he was unable to sleep a single night in peace. He often complained about this, but to no avail, and when he went to Holland during the summer to work as a grass cutter, he told a comrade about his hardships. Then the latter said that he should attempt to catch her when she arrived. He could notice the right time with his feet, for at first the big toe would become paralyzed as she crawled into his bed. At this moment, he should attempt to snatch the creature, and whatever he could take hold of, he should hold fast. And then he would be able to teach her not to torment him. Thus, while he was still in Holland again, he laid down for a nap at noon, and when he was not quite asleep yet, he felt that little hand at his feet and the heaviness in his toe, and so he reached for it and managed to grasp something. But it was, to his surprise, as slippery as an eel. And this is not the only tale that says that. They seem to be slippery. But he clapped his hands together so strongly that it was unable to get away, and suddenly he exclaimed, "Now I've got her!" And she made her best effort to free herself, but he kept his hold, and now she had placating words, and she pleaded to let her go. For she served as a maid in Goldenstedt, and her master had gone to his home, but by the time he went back to the pasture, she would have to be back there as well, out of necessity. She promised him that she would never come to visit him again and asked him to let her go for now, for he knew as well that this was a long way. Then he finally let her get out of his hold, and when she was gone in an instant, he was subsequently freed of her visitation. So, it seems that grabbing the Walrider, if you can do it, which most people recommend using the hair because the body is as slippery as an eel, it seems like you can get a deal out of them to leave you alone. But I don't even think you need the deal, because if you go to the next story, our second to last story, called The Walrider Flees, which also comes to us from Jürgen Hubert. Now, a man in the Zatterland area who was tormented by a Walrider set out to capture her. His brother had to lie down in bed with him at the front, and he laid down at the back, and soon he listened to the Walrider approaching. And he heard clearly how she stepped into his wooden shoes in front of the bed. And at that moment, he jumped up and grasped for the area of the bed where the feet were located, and grabbed the hair of his foe with full strength, who now retreated rapidly. But he held on tightly and ran after her until she was about 50 steps outside of the house, and then he no longer had enough strength left and had to let go of her hair. But from that moment onward, he had peace again. So we see we don't even need the deal. They know you can catch him. They seem to leave you alone. Now, all of these are clever. Whether they succeeded or not, riding them and putting horseshoes on, or using a heckling comb, or making a deal and setting up a trap and whatever. These are all clever. The last one of the night trades cleverness for violence. Our last story of the night has a very telling title of Cutting a Walrider's Throat. A man in Ramslow was tormented every night by a Walrider. One evening he vowed, "If she comes in this evening, I will cut her throat." So then he put his pocket knife openly on the chair before the bed and then went to bed. And soon he saw the Walrider approach. She climbed onto the bed, initially dropped on his feet, but he was ready. He snatched for her, grabbing her at her long curly hair, and took the knife and cut her throat. He then threw foe and knife away from himself. And now he was beset by dread, and he thought, "I have become a murderer." And then he jumped into his bed again. But the next morning he did not dare look round for fear of what he might behold. But when he stood up, he did not see anything. From then on, he had peace at night. And that's our last story, though there are more to be said about them. There's a whole sort of like Selkie angle. I have Selkie tales, by the way, and I'm really on the fence about whether I should read them. If you're not familiar, Selkies are the idea that there's these beautiful sort of mer spirit women that wear the skins of seals when they swim around. It comes up in Irish folklore and also some Norwegian and so on. And if you can, when they come to shore to sort of dance around as pixies in the moonlight, they take off those skins, and if you get those skins, you can basically ransom for pretty girls to be your wives, and then you have to lock up the skins. And it's all basically a metaphor for abusive husbands. And there are great stories about them that are very similar to the Walrider stories in this, where sometimes you can trap a Walrider, who are often pretty girls, in spirit in your house, and force them to be your wives and bear children and take care of your house and basically lock them in. They have a lot of the same sort of abusive husband analogies. The thing is, while they are valid stories and interesting, they are fundamentally distressing. And so I've always been on the fence about whether that's a thing I should be reading. Comments are welcome on the topic. But yeah, most of the rest of the Walrider stories are about men doing that. Often they wind up having their own husbands off wherever their body is lying while they're captured here. Which is an interesting dilemma because it's supposed to be their spirit leaving. And it's not clear. In one of the stories it even says that they will be buried if they don't go back. So I don't know if that just means when their spirit returns their body, because it kind of goes limp and dead and people bury them, whether that means they're going back to be buried alive. I don't know. They don't get into it, but it's grim. Nonetheless, these are the chest-sitting spirits of German folklore. And as we've seen, there are many ways to defeat a Walrider. I don't recommend the cutting the Walrider throat method, though, to be honest, for a pretty simple reason. It could just be someone coming to wake you up. You know, that's not the plan you want. He didn't seem to do his due diligence before swinging a knife. But maybe invite them for lunch. That seemed to be effective. Anyways, we went a little long tonight, but I may come back to the Walriders at some point. Obviously, this was more a collection of sort of anecdotes and tales from the countryside. And I'll try to do something... I'm on the fence about which one to do next week. We have some about sort of German vampires, but I will say the problem with reading any of these sort of folklore versions of those kind of creatures, whether it's vampires or zombies or whatever else, is they don't really align with modern understandings of them, especially vampires. Vampires are very much constructed from very particular individual authors. And they are a lot grimier and more sort of just monstrous in folklore than they are as sort of romantic men who give you a mortal life but are complicated and dangerous. None of them sparkle. I will reassure you of that. I'm also still looking for the right Sheridan Le Fan story because I just love how he writes. And I think I might talk about supernatural bunnies at some point. So, make sure you give this video a like if you liked it, because that's the closest to applause I can get. And if you feel such a thing is owed, I definitely appreciate a like on the video. On the other hand, if you want to stick around for the rest of the spooky stories this season, which will get increasingly intense until October 31st, and then they will ease off into winter stories, feel free to subscribe. Certainly appreciate that. If you want to read some of my own corny horror, varietal-literature.ca is the website, and there's a bunch of tales from me, Rory, on there. Many of which are horror, some of which were modified from things I've written in streams the previous years. Nonetheless, thank you so much to Genera and GS for hanging out with me and talking about chest-crushing spirits. And I will see you next week, or maybe even Thursday, where we're going to play a tabletop RPG about horror. In the meantime, I will keep the fire warm for you. Have a good sleep, but, you know, watch your toes, because there's something always outside, and you just don't want it to get in. I mean, after all, isn't there something knocking on your window?